Soviet territory, Western Front. The roar of tank engines echoed across the Eastern European plains as a new threat emerged on the battlefield. It was unlike anything the world had ever seen, the Soviet T-34, a machine that would become the backbone of the Soviet armored forces. On this early spring day, in the depths of Soviet territory, hundreds of these new tanks were being readied for their first real test, a test that would soon reverberate across the entire world. The T-34's sloped armor gleamed in the pale sun, a design choice that no one, not even the Germans, fully understood yet. It was angled in such a way that enemy shells would glance off or become deflected, a feature that rendered it almost impervious to the German tanks at the time. Its 76.2mm gun, powerful and versatile, had the ability to punch through most defensive lines with ease. But its true strength was in its simplicity. It was easy to produce, reliable, and deadly. However, despite these advantages, the T-34 was largely dismissed by many outside the Soviet Union. To them, it was just another tank, ugly and unrefined, a vehicle that didn't look like the sleek, well-crafted designs they were accustomed to. The T-34, built with practicality in mind, was considered by many to be an unpolished force. And among the Japanese Imperial Army, there was no exception. The T-34 had not yet become a feared name in Asia. It was far from the minds of Japanese officers, who were too focused on their ongoing conquests across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. But that was about to change. In the summer of 1941, the Japanese had their sights set on China. By this time, the Sino-Japanese War was in full swing, and the Japanese were determined to tighten their grip on the country. Little did they know, the T-34 would soon become their worst nightmare. Despite their preconceptions, the Japanese had no idea that the Soviets, in their growing partnership with the Chinese, were about to unleash a tank that would change the game in ways they could not foresee. The Japanese were accustomed to the battlefield where infantry, artillery, and light tanks like the Type 97 Chaiha and the Type 95 Hago roamed. These machines, while effective, lacked the firepower and protection to withstand a true armored assault. The Japanese underestimated how the T-34's advanced design would give the Chinese an edge over their forces. In their eyes, the T-34 was just another Soviet machine, nothing that couldn't be countered by their existing strategies. But in the sweltering heat of the Chinese countryside, a different story was unfolding. August 5, 1941. North China, near the Great Wall. The sun hung high in the sky as the dust swirled around the rolling plains of North China. This region, steeped in history, had become a battlefield for competing empires. The Japanese had been steadily advancing through China, pushing back the nationalists and the remnants of the Red Army. But today, something was different. In the midst of the vast countryside, a new weapon, one that the Japanese hadn't even considered, was about to make its first appearance. As the Japanese infantry marched forward, the sound of rumbling engines reached their ears, an ominous noise that made even the battle-hardened soldiers pause. The first of the Soviet T-34 seconds broke through the thin line of trees that bordered the field, its massive turret swiveling to take in the scene. The tank's tracks crunched over the dry earth as it maneuvered with surprising speed for its size, kicking up clouds of dust. The Japanese officers, observing from a distance, exchanged confused glances. "This is a Soviet tank?" Lieutenant Akira Yoshida muttered under his breath. He was an experienced officer, having seen the Soviet armor from a distance on the Eastern Front, but this was the first time he had encountered one in the field. His experience with tanks had been limited to the lighter Japanese models, fast but fragile, and the T-34 was unlike anything he had seen before. The Soviet tank was designed to strike fear into the hearts of its enemies, and it succeeded. The sloped armor made the T-34 appear almost invulnerable. The Japanese, accustomed to facing tanks with flat, easily penetrated armor, couldn't comprehend how this new tank could shrug off their artillery shells. They didn't know it yet, but their small-caliber anti-tank guns and light tanks would be virtually useless against the T-34's thick, sloped front armor. "It's just a brute force," Yoshida mused aloud, thinking the T-34 would be slow, cumbersome, nothing that couldn't be outmaneuvered or overwhelmed by infantry. His thoughts, however, were about to be violently disproven. The Soviet tank crew, under the command of Lieutenant Ivan Petrov, had no illusions about their tank's lethality. They were seasoned veterans of the Eastern Front, having fought through the brutal battles in the snow and mud of Russia. But they hadn't anticipated this theater of war hot, dry, and filled with dense, unforgiving terrain. Still, the T-34 was made for all kinds of landscapes, and the crew was eager to see how it performed in combat. As they advanced, the Japanese anti-tank positions, hidden in the tall grass and scattered in foxholes, were the first to open fire. Shells from Japanese 37mm anti-tank guns screamed across the battlefield, slamming into the T-34's angled armor. The impacts caused minor vibrations, but nothing more. The Soviet tank hardly seemed to notice. Lieutenant Petrov turned his turret toward the Japanese positions, signaling for the gunner to open fire. The massive 76.2mm gun roared, a sharp crack that echoed across the plains. The shot struck one of the Japanese anti-tank positions, sending a cloud of dust and debris into the air as the gun crew was obliterated. A second shot rang out, striking a nearby Japanese tank. The small Type 95 Hago, with its thin armor, crumpled under the T-34's fire, the blast rendering it a smoldering wreck in seconds. Yoshida, now watching from behind the cover of a rocky outcrop, felt his heart race. This was no ordinary Soviet tank, it was something far more dangerous. As the T-34 rolled over the battlefield, crushing anything in its path, the Japanese officers began to realize their mistake. The power of the tank was evident: its speed, its firepower, and most terrifyingly, its resilience. Their guns could not penetrate its armor, and the tank's gun could tear apart their defenses from miles away. "Fall back!" Yoshida barked, his voice tinged with panic. "Retreat, we need heavier weapons." August 7, 1941. North China, aftermath of the first encounter. In the hours following the first engagement, the dust had not yet settled on the battlefield. The once pristine field now looked like a war zone, with the remains of the Type 95 Hago and scattered Japanese infantry positions lying in ruin. The air, thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and burning debris, was oppressive. Lieutenant Yoshida surveyed the destruction with a growing sense of dread. The T-34 had been a force to be reckoned with, a game-changer on the battlefield. The Japanese forces, accustomed to fighting with lighter tanks and infantry, now found themselves facing a new, formidable enemy. They had assumed that the Soviet Union's tank designs were outdated, clunky machines that could easily be dealt with. But the T-34 had proven them wrong. It was faster than expected, more agile, and most frighteningly, almost impervious to their artillery. Yoshida's command post, located a few miles from the front lines, had already begun receiving reports of further T-34 sightings. The Japanese Army's initial assessment was clear. This tank was not just a nuisance, it was a serious threat. Within hours, a meeting was convened between high-ranking Japanese officers. Major General Hideki Mori, a strategist known for his meticulous planning, had been briefed on the day's events. The T-34's capabilities had been thoroughly underestimated, and now it was wreaking havoc on Japanese positions. As he listened to the reports, he shook his head in disbelief. "How did we miss this?" he muttered to his subordinates. "We have intelligence on Soviet tanks, but no one thought to properly evaluate this one. We're in trouble." The Japanese military had long considered their own tanks, like the Type 97 Chaiha, to be sufficient for dealing with most threats. But the T-34 had proven itself to be an entirely different breed of armored vehicle. Its sloped armor could deflect the shells of their anti-tank guns, and its powerful 76.2mm gun could obliterate their infantry positions from a distance. The Japanese had always prided themselves on tactical flexibility, but against this new enemy, their existing strategies seemed woefully inadequate. "We need to reassess our entire approach," General Mori said grimly. "We can't continue to face these tanks with outdated tactics. It's time to bring out the heavy artillery." But that, as the Japanese were about to learn, would be easier said than done. The heavier Japanese anti-tank weapons, such as the 75mm Type 1 gun, were designed to take on enemy tanks, yet even they had trouble piercing the T-34's sloped armor at anything but point-blank range. The Japanese had underestimated not just the tank's design, but also the speed at which Soviet forces could produce and deploy them. The T-34 wasn't just a single tank, it was part of a growing fleet that could be replaced and mass-produced. And the Japanese military had no answer to that. As reports continued to pour in, the officers began to understand the magnitude of the threat. This was not just a tank, it was a symbol of Soviet industrial might. The T-34 was being produced in large numbers, and its appearance on the battlefield signaled a shift in the balance of power. The Japanese were accustomed to technological superiority, but they were now facing a machine that could easily overwhelm them. And worse, the Soviet Union, with its vast resources and manpower, had the capacity to keep the T-34 rolling off assembly lines in ever greater numbers. The realization that they were up against an opponent who could continually replace its losses began to sink in. August 10, Min 1940. Imperial Army Command, Beijing. The dimly lit war room was filled with a tense silence as Japanese officers huddled around a large map of northern China. The room, located in the heart of the Japanese command in Beijing, reeked of fatigue and frustration. For days, they had been discussing the Soviet T-34 and its devastating impact on their forces, but no one seemed to have a solution. General Mori, his face set in grim determination, paced back and forth in front of the map. He had called this meeting after receiving intelligence reports that the Soviet tanks had broken through another Japanese defensive line and were advancing on a key position in the north. The situation was becoming dire, and the officers had little idea how to stop the onslaught. "Do we have any updates from the front?" Mori asked, his voice sharp. One of his officers, a younger man named Captain Takeshi Fujimoto, stepped forward, his face pale with exhaustion. "General, our infantry units are falling back, and we've lost several anti-tank positions. We've attempted to deploy our heavier guns, but they're ineffective against the T-34's armor. The tanks are simply too fast and too well protected." The room grew quiet as the reality of the situation settled in. The Japanese forces, known for their skill in infantry tactics and mobile warfare, were facing a new kind of threat that rendered their traditional methods almost obsolete. The T-34's speed and agility were overwhelming their defenses, and its powerful armament was shredding their positions from a distance. Fujimoto continued, "The tank is proving nearly impossible to stop. The infantry is doing its best to set ambushes, but the T-34 seconds are too well coordinated with Soviet support units. They push forward relentlessly, and we can't slow them down." Mori stopped pacing and looked at his officers with a stern expression. "This is no longer about stopping individual tanks. This is about halting a mechanized advance, something we are ill-prepared for." He turned back to the map, his finger tracing a line across the northern front. The Soviet Union, despite its previous struggles against the Japanese, had found a new way to fight, a way that exploited the strengths of the T-34 and the power of their industrial might. The Japanese, on the other hand, had built their forces for fast, decisive strikes, but they had not prepared for an enemy that could bring overwhelming firepower to bear. General Mori's thoughts turned to the larger picture. Japan was stretched thin across multiple fronts from the Pacific to China and Southeast Asia. They had built an empire through speed and surprise, but the Soviets had given China a powerful tool that could resist those tactics. The T-34 was a versatile tank, capable of performing well in both open terrain and urban environments, something Japan's existing anti-tank units were not equipped to counter. "We need to find a solution, and quickly," Mori said, his voice cold with resolve. "If we don't act soon, we risk losing all momentum in northern China." August 15, 1941. Northern China, the Japanese response. Days passed, and the pressure on Japanese forces in northern China continued to mount. The T-34 seconds, now a regular presence on the battlefield, were wreaking havoc on the Japanese defenses, forcing them to rethink their entire approach to tank warfare. General Mori's command post was abuzz with activity as officers scrambled to find a way to deal with the Soviet threat. They knew that their current strategy, relying on light tanks and infantry, was hopelessly inadequate against the T-34's firepower and armor. The Japanese response came in the form of a counterattack. If they couldn't stop the Soviet tanks with their existing tactics, they would need to develop something more lethal, something that could match the firepower of the T-34. The answer, at least in theory, was the Japanese Type 97 Chiha, a medium tank that was still in use with the Imperial Army. While it had some success against the older Soviet tanks, it lacked the punch needed to engage the T-34 effectively. However, there was an alternative: the Type 147mm anti-tank gun, a weapon that could, with luck, damage the T-34 at close range. In the days that followed, Japanese forces attempted to mass-produce these anti-tank guns and reinforce their positions. Heavy artillery was also called in, but the problem wasn't just firepower, it was the sheer speed and maneuverability of the T-34. Unlike Japan's slower, more cumbersome vehicles, the T-34 could traverse the battlefield quickly, staying one step ahead of the Japanese gunners and infantry. On the ground, Lieutenant Yoshida and his men found themselves in a race against time. They were tasked with holding a key defensive line, but it seemed hopeless. The Soviet T-34 seconds were not only breaking through their positions, they were doing so with an almost terrifying ease. Each time the Japanese tried to set up an ambush, the T-34 seconds would roll over their positions with alarming speed, cutting down infantry and artillery alike. Their sloped armor made them almost impervious to the Japanese 37mm and 47mm guns, and by the time the Japanese managed to get a hit, the Soviet tanks had already destroyed their defensive lines and moved on. Yoshida, who had once mocked the T-34 as just another Soviet piece of machinery, now found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about warfare. "It's not just the tank itself," he murmured to his men, "it's how they fight together. These tanks aren't just machines, they're part of a larger force, coordinated, relentless." His words hung in the air as the roar of Soviet tanks grew louder in the distance, a sound that filled him with dread. General Mori, realizing the situation was becoming critical, called for reinforcements from other fronts. A desperate plan was formulated to bring in heavier artillery and tank destroyers from Manchuria, but even as the orders were issued, there was an underlying sense of unease. The Soviet T-34 was no longer just a threat, it had become a symbol of Soviet resilience and innovation. In the meantime, the Japanese were learning the hard way that their reliance on mobility and speed was no longer enough to overcome the Soviet juggernaut. They had failed to adapt quickly enough to this new form of warfare. The T-34, with its thick armor, powerful gun, and mechanical reliability, was proving to be a game-changer on the battlefield, and Japan had no immediate solution. August 22, 1941. A Japanese tank trap, North China. The landscape of northern China was a vast expanse of rolling hills, farmland, and craggy terrain, perfect for the kind of guerrilla tactics the Japanese had long relied upon. But as the days wore on, these tactics seemed less and less effective against the onslaught of Soviet armor. The T-34 seconds, sleek and menacing, were everywhere now, cutting through Japanese defensive positions like a hot knife through butter. Lieutenant Yoshida, now part of a special unit tasked with setting up tank traps and anti-tank ambushes, crouched low behind a rocky outcrop. His fingers gripped the rough surface of the terrain as he watched the smoke from distant explosions rise into the sky. In the distance, the unmistakable sound of Soviet tank engines roared ever closer, signaling the arrival of yet another wave of T-34 seconds. The Japanese had set up a series of dug-in positions along the path the Soviets were expected to take, hoping to catch them in a killing zone. It was their last, desperate attempt to slow the Soviet advance. "Hold your fire until they're in range," Yoshida whispered to his men, his voice tense with anticipation. He knew the stakes. The T-34 seconds had already obliterated their positions on several occasions, and if this trap failed, they would be forced to retreat once again. The Japanese had been learning on the fly, adjusting their tactics with each new encounter. They had tried to ambush the Soviet tanks using infantry, but that tactic had failed miserably. The T-34's 76mm gun, capable of smashing through almost any defensive position, had torn apart their troops before they could even get close. Then, they had tried using their Type 97 Chaiha tanks to face off against the Soviet juggernauts, but those tanks lacked the firepower or armor to stand up to the T-34. It became clear that conventional tactics were useless against such a force. As the first T-34 rumbled into view, Yoshida signaled for his men to open fire. The sound of multiple anti-tank guns firing in unison echoed through the air. Several shots hit the T-34's sloped armor, but none penetrated. The tank continued its advance, unfazed. The Japanese fired again, but again, their shots glanced harmlessly off the tank's armor. The T-34's commander, a seasoned veteran named Sergei Pavlov, merely grinned as his tank roared forward, returning fire with deadly accuracy. In a moment of grim realization, Yoshida watched as one of the Soviet tanks fired a round into a concealed position, obliterating a Japanese anti-tank gun with a single shot. The force of the explosion sent a wave of debris into the air, and Yoshida's men scattered for cover. The tank's turret spun again, targeting another group of soldiers. Another shot rang out, and another position was silenced. By now, Yoshida had no illusions. The T-34 seconds were unstoppable in this environment. They could outmaneuver, outgun, and outlast anything the Japanese had to offer. The battle, which had once been a series of calculated skirmishes, had become a grinding war of attrition. Each encounter left the Japanese weaker, each day more demoralizing than the last. In Tokyo, Japanese commanders were beginning to realize that they were not just fighting a war, they were fighting against an industrial powerhouse that could churn out tank after tank. The T-34's production was already scaling up in the Soviet Union, and reports from China indicated that the Soviets were sending more and more of these formidable tanks to reinforce their Chinese allies. Japan's own industrial output was far less capable of matching such a scale. It was a sobering thought, one that only added to the anxiety within the Imperial Army's ranks. General Mori, back in Beijing, knew that the situation had reached a crisis point. His plans had always been based on mobility and surprise, but now, against the T-34, he found himself fighting a war of attrition that could drag on indefinitely. The tank's presence in China had not just altered the balance of power, it had exposed the limitations of Japan's military strategy. September 1st, 1941. Imperial Army Command, Beijing. In the strategic halls of Japan's Imperial Army Command in Beijing, a sense of urgency had settled in. The Japanese High Command, already stretched thin across multiple theaters of war, now faced the growing threat of Soviet T-34 seconds in China, an enemy they could not easily outmaneuver or outgun. The ongoing struggle against these tanks was no longer just a tactical setback, it had become a critical issue that threatened to undo Japan's efforts to conquer the vast expanse of China. General Mori sat at the head of the table in a dimly lit war room, the map of China spread before him. His mind raced as he reviewed the latest reports from the front. The T-34 seconds, still rolling forward, had disrupted every attempt to hold the line. The Japanese army's response had been disorganized, reactive, and ultimately ineffective. No longer could they rely on the quick strikes that had served them well in the past. The T-34 had proven too fast, too resilient, and too powerful. "We need reinforcements, we need heavier firepower," Mori said sharply, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the map. The usual resolve in his voice was now tinged with frustration. "The T-34 seconds are everywhere, and our defensive lines are being torn apart." One officer, Major Kato, spoke up from across the room. "General, we've already deployed our best anti-tank units. We can't rely on more conventional weapons. The problem lies in their tactics. These tanks are coordinated with infantry and air support. We need a new approach, one that disrupts their entire advance." Kato's words struck a chord. The Japanese military had spent so much time focusing on countering the T-34's raw power and armor that they had overlooked how the Soviet forces were using the tank in coordination with their infantry and air forces. The T-34 wasn't just a singular force, it was part of a well-integrated and well-supported mechanized offensive. That integration was something the Japanese were struggling to replicate. "Then what do you suggest?" Mori asked, leaning forward. "More heavy artillery. We can't keep up with their production rate." Kato paused, his eyes flicking from the map to Mori. "We need to adapt to their tactics, not just counter their tanks. We should consider a shift to anti-tank ambushes using guerrilla warfare, but we'll need to bring in our best infantry and mobile units. We can't just stand in one place and shoot. We need to force them into terrain that limits their mobility. Open fields give them too much advantage." Mori nodded slowly, absorbing the suggestion. The idea of adopting more flexible, guerrilla-style tactics wasn't new, but the need for coordinated mobile warfare had never been so urgent. In the past, Japan's army had relied on its infantry and light tanks to engage and harass enemy lines, but now, against the T-34's firepower, they needed to find a way to strike fast and hard before being overwhelmed. However, the problem remained. The Soviet tanks were simply too numerous, and Japan lacked the resources to produce a tank of equivalent capability. Even if they were able to adapt their infantry tactics, they would still be at a disadvantage when facing the sheer volume of T-34 seconds. It wasn't just about winning the battles, it was about holding onto ground that was slipping through their fingers. September 10th, 1941. Northern China, the last stand. The crisp autumn air of northern China carried with it a sense of foreboding. The once vibrant landscape was now scarred by months of brutal fighting. The Japanese were dug in, waiting, hoping that they could make a final stand before the Soviet T-34 seconds broke through their defenses entirely. General Mori, who had been overseeing the war effort from Beijing, had personally traveled to the front to witness the situation firsthand. He had seen the reports, heard the desperate calls for reinforcements, but nothing had prepared him for the grim reality unfolding on the battlefield. The Japanese had gathered what forces they could: infantry, light tanks, and their best anti-tank guns along a key defensive line that ran through a series of narrow valleys and hills. The terrain was uneven, offering some hope that the Soviet tanks, though formidable, might be forced into more limited engagements. But even as the final preparations were being made, Mori could see the inevitable unfolding before him. Lieutenant Yoshida, who had been entrenched in this region for days, surveyed the battlefield through binoculars. His unit had already suffered heavy casualties, and the morale of his men was at an all-time low. The Japanese defenses were hastily constructed, relying on natural terrain features rather than heavy fortifications. In the distance, he could already see the glint of sunlight reflecting off Soviet armor, the first of what he knew would be many T-34 seconds approaching. "Ready yourselves," Yoshida called out to his men. "This is it. If we don't stop them here, they'll break through to the rear. Fight with everything you have." The sound of Soviet tank engines grew louder as the T-34 seconds, accompanied by infantry and support vehicles, came into view. Yoshida's unit opened fire, but as expected, their shots glanced harmlessly off the thick, sloped armor of the advancing tanks. The T-34 seconds, unperturbed, continued their slow but unstoppable advance. Yoshida watched helplessly as his men fired again, and once again, the shells ricocheted off without so much as slowing the Soviet behemoths. In a desperate move, the Japanese infantry tried to engage the tanks at close range, hoping to get in close enough for their anti-tank grenades to be effective. The result was predictable. The T-34 seconds opened fire, their 76mm guns roaring as they decimated the positions with pinpoint accuracy. The Japanese infantry was quickly scattered, with many units retreating in chaos. Yoshida gritted his teeth, unwilling to accept the inevitability of their defeat. But as the T-34 seconds advanced further into their defensive positions, it became increasingly clear they had no answer for this juggernaut. General Mori, watching from a hilltop as his forces were engaged in a vicious firefight below, felt a sinking weight in his chest. He had hoped that the Japanese could hold the line here, at least long enough to buy time for reinforcements from Manchuria. But the Soviet tanks were simply too fast, too deadly. The Japanese, despite their courage, had no way of halting the relentless tide of Soviet mechanized warfare. In the chaos of the battle, it was evident that the T-34 had transformed the way war was fought. The combination of its firepower, speed, and near-impenetrable armor had overwhelmed the Japanese defenses. It was no longer just a tank, it was a symbol of Soviet resilience, industrial might, and innovation. The Japanese were being crushed beneath the weight of a new kind of warfare. Yoshida, exhausted and covered in dirt, finally gave the order to retreat. His men, beaten but not broken, began to pull back, leaving behind their positions and their dead. The T-34 seconds rolled over the remnants of their defenses with ease, and the battle, as devastating as it was, seemed almost insignificant in the face of the larger war. For Japan, the appearance of the T-34 inches northern China had been a sobering lesson. It was a lesson in the power of industrial warfare, the importance of innovation, and the grim reality that no amount of willpower or strategy could overcome a machine designed for total war. September 15, 1941. Imperial Army Command, Beijing. The battle for northern China had ended in yet another crushing defeat for the Japanese. General Mori returned to Beijing in the aftermath, weary and filled with a grim understanding of the stakes. The T-34 seconds had not only disrupted Japan's plans in China, they had shattered the notion that speed, surprise, and tactics alone could secure victory. As Mori sat in the war room, his mind raced. What had seemed like a small tactical problem only months ago had turned into a strategic disaster. The reports piled up on his desk, detailing the losses in men and material. More than half of Japan's anti-tank units had been destroyed, and many of their light tanks and infantry were either disbanded or in full retreat. What was most concerning, however, was the relentless nature of the Soviet advance. The T-34 seconds had already proven their worth on the battlefield, and the Soviet Union, with its vast industrial resources, was capable of producing these machines in overwhelming numbers. For the Japanese, this was a sobering realization. The traditional methods of fighting quick, mobile raids with light tanks, swift infantry advances, and high-mobility artillery had been rendered obsolete by the brute force of the T-34. There was no room for subtlety or speed when facing an adversary who could bring the full weight of mechanized warfare to bear. The T-34 isn't just a tank, Mori muttered to himself, reflecting on the recent battles. It's a paradigm shift. A game-changer in every sense of the word. Despite the devastation, the Imperial Army leadership still clung to the hope that they could somehow develop a countermeasure. Some argued for improving Japan's own tanks, but they were painfully aware of the technological gap. Japan's Type 97 Chiha tank, while effective in certain roles, was hopelessly outclassed by the T-34's firepower, armor, and versatility. There was talk of developing new weapons, more powerful guns, and better armor. But even if they succeeded in matching the T-34 in some aspects, Japan still lacked the industrial base to produce these technologies in the numbers required to counter the Soviet onslaught. It became clear to General Mori and his colleagues that they could no longer rely on their traditional military doctrine. The Soviet Union, by producing the T-34, had introduced a new kind of warfare, one that demanded mass production, industrial might, and technological superiority. The Japanese were facing a reality where their own resources, meager in comparison to those of the Soviets, would be stretched to the breaking point. The initial underestimation of the T-34 had proven disastrous, and now, Japan was paying the price. December 1941. A shift in the Pacific. While Japan continued to struggle with the Soviet threat on the mainland, a new theater of war was opening to the east. The attack on Pearl Harbor had dragged the United States into the conflict, and now Japan found itself fighting a two-front war, one in China against the Soviets, and one in the Pacific against the Americans. The Pacific War would soon dominate Japan's strategic focus, and the Soviet threat would be sidelined, at least temporarily. But the lessons learned in northern China would not be easily forgotten. The T-34's devastating effectiveness had made a lasting impact on Japanese military thinking. Its ability to dominate the battlefield, combined with the unrelenting Soviet tactics, forced Japan's military leaders to reconsider their entire approach to warfare. As Japan's resources were funneled into the Pacific and new priorities emerged, the Soviets would continue to refine and deploy the T-34 with devastating effect. In the long term, the Japanese would never fully recover from their failure to adequately counter the T-34. The tank's influence rippled across the global battlefield, not just in China but in Europe, where it would be a key player in the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany. For Lieutenant Yoshida, who had witnessed firsthand the T-34's destructive power, the war had forever changed him. The once invincible confidence of the Imperial Army had been shattered. As he trudged back from the battlefield, weary and broken, he thought back to the early days of the war when the Japanese had believed themselves invincible. The T-34 had taken that illusion and crushed it beneath its treads. For Japan, the war against the Soviet Union was but a brief chapter in a larger, more complex conflict. But the impact of the T-34 was undeniable. In the years to come, military leaders across the world would look to the Soviet tank as a defining moment in the history of armored warfare. It was a machine that, for a time, had seemed like an unstoppable force, an adversary that even the mighty Japanese Imperial Army could not defeat.